Shalom, Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com. Christ is the end of the law. I'm sure you've heard that quoted. I'm sure you've read it in the scriptures. It is indeed in the scriptures. How have you heard it quoted before? This is a verse that can be somewhat controversial because it can be interpreted in a couple different ways. Now, I'm a Messianic Jew, and so I do a lot of Jewish stuff. My family and I, we celebrate Shabbat, the Sabbath, on Saturday, from Friday evening at sundown to Saturday evening at sundown. We celebrate the feasts of the Lord from Leviticus chapter 23. I have a prayer shawl, a talit, and it has the tzitzit, the fringes on the corner, and I put that on when I pray. I do stuff from the law. I do Old Testament stuff, and if you maybe you keep some of the law, or maybe you felt a drawing to be a little more Torah observant or something, you've probably encountered people quoting this verse at you and saying, well, you shouldn't be doing that stuff because Christ is the end of the law. Basically meaning Jesus did away with the law, and it's over. All that Old Testament stuff is over, and so why are you trying to bring it back? Why are you going back to those things? Maybe you're somebody who has felt a drawing to keep more of the law of God. You've seen the blessing in it, and you find meaning in it, and you've even found it to be an expression of your love to God, or an expression of your desire to follow Jesus and to do what Jesus did. Maybe you're that person, or maybe you're the person who believes that the law is done away with, and that it's actually it's like denying Christ to go back to that stuff, and it's forsaking the grace of God. So regardless of what your thoughts may be, why don't we look at this verse together? I want to show you a really great way to understand the Bible better, to do in-depth Bible study. This is a tool, and along the way we're gonna try and see what Paul was really talking about here. What did he mean? Something to remember about Bible translations is there is no absolutely literal word-for-word translation. Every translation, to a certain degree, is an interpretation. Unfortunately, the translators, they're always forced to say, okay, what was the author trying to say here? What did he mean? And then, what are the words that I can use to try to best communicate that in the language that I'm translating into? So there's always some interpretation that happens there, and that's definitely true when it comes to the writings of Paul and when it comes to this verse. So here's a handy thing. This is eSword. It's free Bible software. If you don't have it, I definitely recommend that you get it. And you can download all of your favorite translations, the ones that you want to consult. As you can see here, Bibles, commentaries, dictionaries. It's a great tool. And so I have a bunch of different translations, and some are a little closer to paraphrases, loaded on my version of eSword. And here's a really handy feature. On the right-hand side here, you can see where it says compare. So what you do is you click on the verse that you want to, that you're interested in. You hit compare, and it'll show you how it's translated in all of the versions that you have lined up. Now, I have some mostly more literal word-for-word translations, and then some that are a little bit closer to, that are more trying to communicate the meaning of the text. And then I also have a couple of Messianic Jewish translations of the Bible loaded. So let's have a look at how this verse is interpreted in different versions. All right. So firstly, let's look at the Christian ones. You have the English Standard, the KJV, New American Standard, NIV, NRSV. All of these basically, they all phrase it the same way. They phrase it, Christ is the end of the law. Now, the New Living Translation, that's definitely more of a little bit more of a paraphrase. It says Christ has already accomplished the purpose for which the law was given. So that's a bit more of a mouthful, and they're obviously trying to communicate a specific sense there. Young's Literal says Christ is an end of law. Okay. Now, there are a couple of Messianic Jewish translations here also. This is the Complete Jewish Bible done by Dr. David Stern. His isn't as word for word. He tries to communicate the sense of the passage. So he renders this: the goal at which the Torah aims is the Messiah, who offers righteousness to everyone who trusts. I really like his translation of this concept of believing, because sometimes in English when we talk about believing, we just think it means to consciously think a certain way, or maybe to give intellectual or verbal assent to something. But the Hebrew word to believe, it has the sense of trust, which is a relational thing. And it also has the sense of faithfulness. To believe is to have faith, and to believe is to be faithful, and that's a very critical component also of believing. If you say you believe something, but then you're totally inconsistent with that, and you're not faithful to what you say you believe. Well, do you really believe it? So there's definitely that lifestyle component. There's that element not just of saying something or giving mental assent to it, but also living it out in your life in a faithful way. And so that original Hebrew understanding of faith is definitely communicated in Dr. David Stern's rendering, and then also in the Tree of Life version, which is a more recent Messianic Jewish translation that was done by a team of scholars. Let's look at how it's rendered there. For Messiah is the goal of the Torah as a means to righteousness for everyone who keeps trusting. So this is interesting. They don't even just have the word, everyone who trusts, but everyone who keeps trusting. Again, it's communicating that sense of faithfulness. This isn't just a one-time thing when you say where you say the sinner's prayer. This is a lifelong thing of believing in the Messiah and entering into that trusting relationship. All right. So here's a question: what right do these Messianic Jewish translators have to interpret it this way? That not that Christ is the end of the law, like the Torah is over, but done away with, but that Messiah is the goal of the Torah, that he is the one at whom the law aims. Do they really have a right to interpret it that way? That is what we're going to look at next. Now I'm going to show you another very powerful feature on eSword. You can see here I have the New American Standard loaded, and then I also have NASB Plus. And I did have to pay for this, but you can do the same thing on the King James. And the King James is like it's automatically installed on eSword. In fact, if you uninstall it, you go back into the the source files on your computer and you uninstall King James, it'll automatically install it again next time you start it up. So this thing ain't going away, and that's just fine. So let's do this with the KJV, just because it's something you can do regardless of whether you get some of these other translations. All right. So did you say here there's KJV and there's KJV plus? Whoa! That means it's with the Strong's numbers. This is getting strong. This is going to be a strong study. All right. So look at all these little numbers here. These are the Strong's number for every word. So you're going to go there. You're going to mouse over the word that you're interested in. What does it mean that Christ is the end of the law? And it shows you. Okay, so this is Strong's number 5056. It's the Greek word telos, and then it gives you a sense of what it means. And it also it tells you how many times it's used, 42 times. All right, so that's handy in and of itself. Now let's take this a step further. Right click, it gives you a quick search option. You can also hit Control S, but that isn't as quick. That's why if you right click and it gives you the quick search option, it's quicker. I know, I'm profound today, aren't I? All right, now this is kind of hilarious, entire Bible. Like you don't have to. This is only going to be in the New Testament, because the New Testament's the Greek part, right? If you search Greek Strong's numbers in the Hebrew Bible, you're not going to find anything. So let's just go right to New Testament, and we're going to click on that New Testament, and it's going to show us every time this word occurs and how it's translated. And I did you a favor. Would you like to hear the favor I did you? I went through these, and I took a selection of them, and I put them in a regular document, because I don't know about you, but this is a little hard on the eyes. Like you're reading, and you almost feel like you're getting punched repeatedly in the face. You're like, whoa, different colors, whoa, numbers, like, oh, and this word's highlighted. Like, man, this is very colorful. It almost looks like a work of art. If you like blur your eyes and you look at it, it all just becomes like all these different colors and things, and it almost becomes very artistic. I don't know, maybe you could even blur your eyes and patterns would emerge that would just be incredibly spiritually profound. Okay, I'm totally kidding. But so what I did for you, and I hope you love me for this, is let's bring it up here. I I compiled some of these verses just with regular text. So basically, this is how this Greek word telos, where it says Christ is the end of the law, Christ is the telos of the law. This is how this word is translated in other places. It's also translated as outcome, as finished, as continually, as fulfillment, as goal, and as sum. And we're not going to go over every single one of these together, but I'll point out a couple to you that stand out. So firstly, in the Gospel of Matthew, Yeshua, Jesus, he talks about the end, and that's actually the word that's used, telos. So you can see why translators and would translate this as like Christ is the end of the law, like it's over, and that you can see why people would maybe understand that from the Greek word telos. However, is that the only meaning of the word? No, it's not the only meaning of the word. There are a couple more where it has that sense. Now this is interesting. It says Yeshua gets arrested. Peter's following at a distance. Peter goes in and says he sits down with the officers to see the outcome, to see the telos. Now that's an interesting way that word is used. Now here's one. Satan, if he's divided against himself, he's finished. So that's that Greek word telos. So you can see how this word, this passage in Paul, you can see why some people would be like, oh, okay, so yeah, the law's finished, right? Christ is the end of the law. The Torah is finished. It's over. His kingdom will have no end. Now, this is an interesting one. Continually. It has the sense of continually. Let's remember that. There's a passage about the Messiah. It had its fulfillment in him. It's that word telos. Yeshua loved his disciples to the end. Now, this is interesting. Outcome. The outcome of shameful things is death. That's telos. The outcome of some of these good things like sanctification is eternal life. So Paul uses this word in the sense of outcome in both a positive and a negative way. This is interesting. Paul writing 2,000 years ago, said that he and his audience were people upon whom the ends of the ages had come. It's interesting that the world didn't end 2,000 years ago. So obviously that word doesn't always mean like the end, like the termination. It's over because, history's still happening. So what was he talking about? Well, there are some different ways this word can be understood, as you can see. What if you understood the end there in the sense of like if you're aiming at something, if it's your goal or your objective, it's almost like that's the pinnacle, that's the high point, that's the climax, that's the culmination. Maybe that would be a better understanding, Similarly, later in Corinthians he says, then comes the end when Messiah hands over the kingdom to the God and Father. All right, so again, is that the end of history, or is that the end more like the goal of history, the ultimate climax of history, like that climactic moment when he hands over the kingdom back to God? Does that make that more meaningful? When you think about the end of the world, when Yeshua talked about the end, not like doom and gloom, boom, it's all over, but rather the apex of history, the highest point. Okay, now look at this one. Paul says the goal of his instruction was love from these three things. That's the word telos there. So remember that these Messianic Jewish translators, they had this understanding, this interpretation that Christ wasn't the end of the law in the sense of it's over, but rather that Christ is the goal of the law, that he is. So you can see here that yes, indeed, they did have grounds for this understanding, just based on other ways that this word is used. So a couple more here. I'm not going to go over them all. I don't want to lose you. Here's an interesting one. James, the outcome of the Lord's dealings. Now, did that mean that the Lord was done with Job, that he didn't deal with Job anymore after Job's suffering? No, clearly not. God continued to deal with him. So what does that mean? So, again, it's the sense of like an outcome in like almost like an ongoingly. This is a continuous thing. Peter used this word to say to sum up. So like a summary. Yeshua uses this word to describe himself, that he is the end, that he is the telos. That's a big one. He's the goal. He's the objective. So again, these are the words that are used to translate this Greek word telos as it's used throughout the writings of the New Testament. Does that give you a better understanding right there of what Paul was talking about? Was he saying that indeed Jesus did come to do away with the law, even though Jesus said not to even think that he came to do away with the law? Obviously, no, that's not what he was talking about. So we can rule out that particular interpretation, which unfortunately is a very popular misinterpretation of Paul in Christian circles. What's a better understanding? A better understanding is that God gave the Torah as a way to the Messiah. That when you read the Pentateuch, it should be pointing you to Jesus. It's almost like that's the outcome. The outcome of Torah study should be a closer relationship with the Messiah, believing in Messiah as the one to make you right with God, and just to make you right in general, because you're messed up and there's stuff in you that's wrong. And so righteousness isn't just this positional thing where, God says I'm good with him even though I'm still a total mess. No, it's not that. It's not just positional. It's real. God is actually making you right from the inside out. And that's part of this broader campaign that he's on, to make the cosmos right again, to make everything right again. And then we have the sense of like the fulfillment or the goal or the sum. So the law is summed up in the Messiah. Yeshua is the goal of the Torah. So that's hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better sense of Romans chapter 10, verse 4. Now, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but this is a takeaway from a Hebrew verses lesson that I just finished filming. We're actually just reading through the epistle of St. Paul to the Romans. We're reading a translation of it into biblical Hebrew, like biblical style Hebrew, versus, let's say, modern Hebrew. There are modern translations of the New Testament into modern Hebrew, but we're reading through one in more biblical style Hebrew. And so one of the things I did in my lesson is I also looked at some different ways that this word was translated into Hebrew by Messianic Jewish scholars, mostly from the 1800s actually. And I'll show those to you, but we're not going to go into that in too much depth here, because I want to keep this short and to the point. But these are some different ways. So this is Zolkinson, Yitzchak Zolkinson's translation. He used the word tachlit right here. In translating Romans chapter 10, verse 4, he used the word tachlit, which has the sense of like the object or the goal. Similarly, this is Ezekiel Margoliouth's translation from the mid-1800s. This is actually the only cantillated version of the New Testament. So it has all of the little marks so that you can in the Jewish world we'd use the word lean. It's like leaning the New Testament, which is kind of a fascinating concept, because usually we talk about leaning Torah. It means to sing the Torah, not just to read it, but to sing it. Anyways, and he uses the word tachlit also. And there are a couple others. I think it's probably a good place to stop. So anyways, if maybe that's been a question in your mind, what was Paul talking about when he said that Christ is the end of the law? Did he mean that the Torah is in our past and not in our future? Did he mean that Jesus came to do away with the law? Did he mean that we might as well just not read the Pentateuch anymore, because that stuff doesn't really apply so much, to the New Testament believer, the New Covenant believer? Well, hopefully today we learn that wasn't what he was talking about. One really important thing when it comes to Paul is not to read Paul, but to read like the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and then to read Paul in context. Because if Paul says one thing, and then like the rest of the Bible says something different, it doesn't mean that Paul was wrong. It means that your understanding of Paul is wrong. Or maybe it even means that the translator's interpretation of Paul was a little bit off. The Bible isn't wrong. If it's a question of like the Bible being wrong or us being wrong, it's like it's us that's wrong, right? So if it looks like Paul is disagreeing with the rest of Scripture, then no, Paul wasn't disagreeing. Our reading of Paul is disagreeing, right? So anyways, my encouragement to you is to don't let the dust collect on the first, like 3/4 of your Bible. Yes, be a New Covenant believer for sure. Be so Messiah-centered, absolutely. But at the same time, remember that the Old Testament is the Bible that Jesus read, and it's also the Bible that the apostles who wrote the New Testament read. So the context of the New Testament is the Old Testament. If you want to read the New Testament in context, you got to read the Old Testament. And God said stuff in the Old Testament, like in the Torah. For instance, there are many times when God gave laws to his people Israel, and he said, this is a law forever. For instance, he said that about Shabbat, the weekly Sabbath. He said, this is a sign between me and Israel forever. This is a law forever. He said that about several of the other festivals and appointed times also, about a bunch of the other laws. So if God says that these laws are forever, obviously you can't say, well, then Christ came and just did away with them. Christ is the end of the law. That doesn't work. If something is forever, it means like it's without end. So can you see how that works? So automatically, if you start by reading the Torah itself, then it'll help you to better understand Paul's words and what he was talking about, and also what he wasn't talking about. Another example would be, if you read the prophets, they describe the future. They describe what the world is going to look like when Jesus comes back. For instance, at the end of Isaiah, he talks about all flesh. That means everybody on the planet worshiping God from Sabbath to Sabbath and from new moon to new moon. Like that's stuff that goes way back to the law. You know what I mean? Not in a bad sense, of course, but like new moon, like that's the Jewish calendar. That's like a lunar-based calendar. Interesting. The end of Zechariah, he talks about all the nations celebrating the festival of booths. Not even just Israel, but all the nations. The last 8 chapters of Ezekiel talk about Israel being restored to the land of Israel, and all the tribes being reapportioned their own chunks of land. Talks about a future temple that hasn't been built yet, that's going to be built when Messiah comes. So, anyways, if your reading of Paul isn't based on a firm foundation in the previous revelation of God in the law and the prophets, you might get Paul wrong. You might end up misinterpreting him, and that could mess you up. And so anyways, just as a friend, my encouragement to you is read the Bible, read the whole Bible, and then read Paul in the context of the rest of the Bible. And so hopefully this was a fun little conversation for you. Hopefully it maybe answered a question that had been hanging in your mind. If you're one of those people who keep, who observe a little more of the Torah than most Christians, then, most Christians do observe much of the Torah, by the way, because much of the law is moral law, and Christians keep the moral law because it's the law of love. But then there's some things that, maybe some Christians keep that lots of other Christians don't, the feasts or whatever. If you're one of those people or maybe you put on a prayer shawl, with the fringes on the corner. If you do that stuff and you've caught flack for it, from people saying, well, Christ is the end of the law, maybe you wondered what that verse really meant. So hopefully this will help you to help other people better understand Paul. Anyways, this was, like I said, this was a little takeaway from my most recent Hebrew verses study. Just reading through Romans, trying to better understand it, and reading through it in Hebrew, reading through it in the language of the Old Testament, trying to better understand the writings of the Apostle Paul in the broader context of the Bible that Paul read, the Old Testament. I'd love to have you study with us on a regular basis. We're an educational website at holylanguage.com. We're a community of disciples, with a focus on discipleship to the Messiah, studying the Bible and understanding it better, learning Hebrew together as an act of discipleship and as a way to come closer to Yeshua. So come check us out at holylanguage.com, and thanks for joining me in this little discussion about Romans chapter 10, verse 4, and what it means that Christ is the end of the law.